So my name is Eliav. I teach international law at Tel Aviv University, and maybe we should begin. Do we have until 1:30? That's the.
Pretty much. That's true.
Okay. So my talk, as you can see, the title is on the continuous and concurrent application of ad Bellum and Bello Proportionality. I know that you've addressed some related issues in previous talks, so I'd be happy to get your input. This is a book chapter that is forthcoming in the book on the presentation. So there's still time to make changes. I'll be happy to hear what you think. So, ad Bellum proportionality. As you know, I have several computers here. So in modern international law, there's a prohibition on the use of force, right? Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. One exception is the right to self-defense once an armed attack occurs. But one limitation is that any response should be proportionate, right? So proportionality about use ad bellum, and we'll get into what that means. Nobody really, there's not much agreement about that, seeks to limit the scope of a defensive action against an armed attack, right? And usually we think about use ad bellum as something that is assessed as a whole in relation to the armed attack. But international law regulates also the conduct of hostilities themselves, right? This is IHL, or use in bello, of law of armed conflict, or whatever. And use in bello has its own proportionality test, which seeks to regulate every single attack, right? And measures the concrete and direct military advantage expected by the attack in light of the incidental civilian harm expected, and seeks to kind of balance between these two values. And once the incidental harm is excessive, the attack would be unlawful, right? So it is generally accepted in law that these realms are separate, right? But there's still much room for some interaction between them. And this paper specifically discusses two aspects of the possible interaction between ad bellum and in bello proportionality. The first is temporal, and concerns the continuous application of use ad bellum proportionality throughout an armed conflict, right? The second is a substantive interaction and relates to the manner in which both proportionality tests would apply in the same time, meaning concurrently, and this is assuming that use ad bellum proportionality applies throughout the conflict. As we will see, this is a question, at least according to some views. So we begin on the temporal level, and we'll get more into detail in a bit. And here we see two different approaches. And one is best represented by Yoram Dinstein from my own university, who argues that at least in some cases, proportionality ceases to apply once an armed conflict crosses a certain threshold, right? So I call this the static approach, right? Because at some point proportionality is frozen, right? The other approach, historically or traditionally represented by Christopher Greenwood, is that use ad bellum, including proportionality, has to be assessed continuously throughout the war. So I call this the continuous application approach. So I offer my own take on this debate, which is basically tries to look at what are the underlying theoretical and normative assumptions behind these approaches, and try to critique them and suggest possible interaction, right? So that's the temporal level. On the substantive level, the question is, well, if we assume that they apply at the same time, how do they interact, if at all, right? And as those of you who looked at the paper probably noted, if we say that there is some kind of continuous application of ad bellum proportionality, there is a push or a pressure for some conflation, right? And my argument in this paper is that although there are some underlying normative rationales that are common to proportionality on both spheres, we should keep them functionally separate. And when I mean functionally, I mean not necessarily morally or ethically, but in terms of how law should operate. Now, we will see, part of the problem about talking, when we're talking about the interaction between both levels of proportionality, is that the content of jus ad bellum proportionality is very contested, right? So everybody knows at least what the black letter says about jus in bello proportionality. We have concrete and direct military advantage, we have incidental harm, and it's kind of a harms benefit analysis, right? About ad bellum proportionality, we have different views. Some look at the test as a quantitative test, a tit-for-tat test. We look at the scope of the armed attack and the scope of the defense. Some look at it as a means-end test, whether the response is tailored to halt and repel an attack. And some suggest that we have to look at jus ad bellum proportionality from a harms-benefit perspective also. Look at the entire, the harms caused by the attack and the benefits reaped from the defense. That comes from just war theory, and we'll discuss it a bit. And this problem will underlie the entire discussion, because we have to decide what are the contents of ad bellum proportionality in order to talk about the relations between the two spheres. So let's begin with the static approach and the continuous approach. So the methodology of my paper is kind of to look at the normative elements of the static approach, try to justify it, or at least understand what those that support this view, how can they justify this approach, and then expose the limits of this approach in order to argue for a test of continuous application. As I said earlier on, the static approach assumes that once an armed conflict crosses a certain threshold, jus ad bellum is no longer relevant. Rather, we are now entering the realm of jus in bello, and we have to assess every single attack, but not look at the situation as a whole. And the foremost proponent of this approach is Yoram Dinstein, and he distinguishes between measures short of war, that have to be subjected to proportionality analysis all throughout. But once we enter the realm of war as a separate, distinct category, proportionality fades out. And then we can actually have total war, a war in which the defender can completely subdue the attacker. So proportionality, according to this view, is assessed only in the inception of war, and it consists of the question whether the gravity of the armed attack justifies war as a defensive response. Once we cross that threshold, there is no longer a continuous application. So how can we justify, or what can be the normative underpinnings of such a position? So in the paper, I identify at least 3 possible explanations, and I show that I think they're not too convincing. One is what I call war exceptionalism. And war exceptionalism simply assumes that there is something distinct in the human activity of war that distinguishes it both morally and practically from any other form of human violence, whether individual violence between persons or collective types of violence that do not amount to war, right? So this is probably one of the points of departure. The other possible normative justifications is what I call the fixed just cause approach, right? And this approach assumes that self-defense remains legal throughout, right? So once we have an identifiable aggressor, right, the aggressor-defender relations are fixed, right? So nothing that happens later on can cause the defender to become the aggressor, even if the defender reacts in a way which is much wider than the initial attack, right? And the last position, and we can see this also in Dinstein's writing, is the formal justification approach. And according to this approach, because we have no way or no requirement to assess proportionality in terms of the facts on the ground after war starts, the only way to terminate war is through a formal decision. So as long as there is a formal state of war, right, we don't have to make continuous jus ad bellum assessments, right? Only jus in bello assessments, right? So, and this approach is actually dramatic in its implications for the relations between Israel and Syria, right? Because as you know, probably from the news, once every several weeks, Israel reportedly or admittedly attacks certain objectives in Syria. And a possible legal justification, and this is not an official justification that I've seen, but if you read Dinstein, so it seems logical that this is part of the justification, is that there is a formal state of war with Syria since the 1970s because the countries never terminated their state of war, and therefore we don't have to justify every attack according to a specific use at Bellum analysis, but as long as the attacks conform with use in Bello, that's enough. So in sum, the static approach comprises three interrelating positions: war exceptionalism, fixed just cause, and formal justification. Right, so the paper looks at more in depth into these justifications and challenges them. So let's begin with war exceptionalism. Where is the mouse? Here it is. Okay. So let's look at the assumptions of this idea that once that we have war, no need for proportionality. So this approach presupposes that there is a fundamental difference between violence short of war and war, and this difference justifies a different moral or legal approach. And two strands of arguments can serve to explain or justify this view. One is that war is ethically and morally different from other forms of violence. So we can't look at war and judge it in accordance with the same moral perceptions that would apply to any other forms of violence, including proportionality. The others is more of a realist argument. And this argument is because of the special dynamics of war, the reciprocal action, the constant escalation, there is no practical way to do proportionality once we have a full-scale war going on. Right? So in my view, these objections are hard to defend, both in positive law and also in just war theory. So when we look at positive international law, if we look at Greenwood and others, they point out that war is no longer a distinct legal term, more or less anywhere in international law that deals with war or with armed conflict. So the term war itself has been superseded by the term armed conflict, which is functional and looks at every situation which hostilities occur, right? So we don't have anymore this special category of war that entails different normative considerations in terms of law, right? So as Greenwood points out, war, looking at war as a legal distinct category is actually a remnant of the pre-UN Charter era in which we had the laws of war and the laws of peace, and states could freely, more or less, move between them, right? And in order to identify whether we have moved from peace to war, and then triggering neutrality in the laws of war, etc., we had to actually say that a formal state of war or a material state of war exists. But nowadays we don't really have the same categories. Now in just war theory, I think it's more interesting, right? Because the assumption of war exceptionalism actually ties into broader discussions in contemporary just war theory between traditional approaches that think that war is something special and revisionist approaches that say, well, war is only, a large mass of people killing each other. It's not anything special in terms of morality. So traditionalists will say, well, maybe there are situations or reasons to differentiate war from other situations, right? War is a clash between sovereigns. War is a situation of presumed mutual threat between combatants, etc. Revisionists will simply say, well, proportionality, if it applies between individuals and it applies in measures short of war, it has to apply also in wars. Right? Wars are no different. They're more complex, right? But normatively, they're just a massive interaction between persons. Right? So on this view, there's actually no way to distinguish war between other uses of violence. And I think revisionism is becoming the new orthodoxy in how we look at just war. So this approach has to be taken into consideration. So fixed just cause, right? So fixed just cause, recall, means that the aggressor-defender relations are frozen at the inception of the conflict, and therefore whatever the defender does once war erupts cannot change these relations. So is this convincing? What can be the assumptions of this approach? So one, I think, is maybe the common sense intuition that says, well, the aggressor is morally responsible for initiating the war, and therefore he can't, or she or it cannot complain if the defender really takes it to the end, right? So you're responsible for the war, you're responsible for its consequences. Well, I think this is, maybe works when you troll people on Twitter, but it doesn't really cut it when we think about its normative assumptions, right? Because even if we look at the traditionalist view, all right, so Michael Walzer famously says that when we look at war, we have to equate between states and individuals, right? So whatever morality applies between individuals as such will apply between states as such, right? The state is an individual on the international plane, right? So it's crystal clear that if the state is an individual on the international plane, it can't, in self-defense, exceed what is needed to halt the attack, because this is not something that is available to individuals on the domestic level, right? We know that if we're attacked in day-to-day life, we can't react in a manner which is more than is needed to curtail the attack. Right? And revisionists will actually share this view in a slightly modified form. They will say that, well, basically, when you are defending in a scope that is wider than what is needed to repel the attack, you're killing innocent people. You're killing people who are no longer threatening. The aggressor's combatants are no longer threatening. They're no longer an aggressor, so to say, because you have repelled the armed attack. So this, I think, is this argument is not convincing. The other view, I think, comes from an intuition that war can be a punishment. So when the defender acts in excess of the initial armed attack, it is actually punishing the aggressor for their wrongdoing. Now, this view actually has deep roots in just war theory and also in international law before the UN Charter. Right? War was understood as something that can be punitive, right? That can be undertaken as a response to a prior wrong, even if not in defensive terms. So the initial reaction is defensive, right? We were repelling the armed attack, and then whatever comes later on is punishment, right? But this, too, I think, is not convincing, right? Because, first of all, in terms of positive law, so positive law doesn't recognize as war as a relevant or lawful form of punishment. Right? So if we look at countermeasures at the draft articles on state responsibility, they cannot involve a use of force, right? A use of force can be only defensive, right? But also in moral terms, even if we assume that war can be a moral form of punishment, and I don't assume so, but even if we do assume so, that also won't justify the notion of fixed just cause. Because all theories that justifies war as punishment actually connect between the punishment and a certain goal that you have to achieve while undertaking this form of punishment, right? So you would have to continuously assess whether your punishment achieves the goal of punishment. You can't just say, well, no holds bar, we can just because if you do that, you actually collapse what would be lawful punishment or morally justified punishment into a form of unlimited vengeance, right? Punishment has to be limited in some way, right? So this too, I think, is unconvincing. Now, I think the most challenging justification for fixed just cause, and also to the idea of war exceptionalism, is a practical argument, right? In this argument, you see here a portrait of von Clausewitz, is the argument from Total War, right? And on this view, limitlessness is actually part and parcel of the human phenomenon of war. Because once war erupts, we have a dynamic of escalation, right? And the goals of war shift throughout the campaign. So there is no way to limit, once war erupts, the scope of the initial defense, right? So, and this approach is theoretically attributed to Clausewitz, but we see it also in the writing of some international lawyers, notably Oppenheim, before the UN Charter, of course. He argued that war begins for a certain end, but there are no limitations from changing or expanding the aims throughout the war, right? So if the defender can change the objectives throughout the war, you can't really assess proportionality. That's like a moving target, right? So every time the goal of the campaign changes, that's problematic. So this is a real problem. And I think if we think of it in terms of the dynamics of armed conflicts, it reflects the problem of what I call the problem of counter responses, right? So we have the initial armed attack, and then we have the defense, and then the aggressor counter responds to defense, and then the defender has a new just cause because we have a new counter response, and that can go ad infinitum forever. Now we see this happening in the Israel-Syria context quite often. So you would see, and I'm not getting into the initial legality of the Israeli strikes. That's a huge question. But even if we assume that the initial Israeli strike is lawful, then we have a response by the Syrian anti-aircraft batteries, and then Israel attacks the batteries themselves, and then Syria counter-responds. How does this end? How can we measure this, or pinpoint the situation where self-defense action becomes disproportionate? So this is a difficulty, but I don't think it entails giving up on continuous application of proportionality altogether. And I argue in the paper that we have a way, I think, to think of requirement that at a certain point, the defender has to ask itself whether, if I halt my defensive activities right now, the aggressor will halt its own counter responses. And that's the point in which I think a further defensive action might be disproportionate. And admittedly, this is hard to apply, and it has to be applied only by, of course, higher echelons of command or the diplomatic apparatus. This connects into the next point about who is actually, or what is the relation between the determination of ad bellum and in bello proportionality. Ido, how much time do I have left?
Totally or?
No, for my talk. You tell me, because what?
20 minutes are good for you?
Sure, yeah, I'll try to do it in less. The last component of the static approach is the formal justification approach, right? And this approach, recall, just says, well, once a war is formally going on, even if there are no active hostilities, we don't need new proportionality assessments. And this, I think, is probably the less convincing of all three of these pillars, for two reasons. First of all, like I said before, the legal category of war doesn't really exist in such a forceful manner in modern law, which obviously leads to the diminishing of the importance of formal war also, right? And actually, if we look at the practice of the UN and the UN Security Council, it was Egypt that in the 1950s tried to argue that it is in a continuous state of formal war with Israel in order to justify its application of belligerent wartime measures against shipping to Israel. And there the Security Council said, no, a formal state of war does not make it, does not do the job. You have to show that there is active belligerency. Right? And I think this is also easy to justify morally, right? A formal state of war does not justify killing. It does not justify occasioning harm to your own soldiers. I would add that there are, I think, possible effects to a formal state of war, and these are more epistemic effects or evidentiary effects, right? So I think if two states are in a formal state of war and a defender or a potential defender tries to argue that there's an imminent armed attack, right? So it's easier to justify if there's already a condition of formal animosity between these parties, right? So if we look at the Israel-Syria situation, right? So if the Syrian military amasses forces on the border, that would be probably different than if we have something on the border between Switzerland and Italy, right? And the formal state of war is actually a statement of formal animosity that might play a role here. So the takeaway for the ongoing proportionality analysis that even when a formal state of war exists, proportionality has still to be assessed functionally in light of a specific threat or armed attack. So that's the rejection of the static approach, at least as how it was in the way I see it. Right. So I just want to quickly, and I probably not do. Won't spend more than 10 minutes about it, although it's a huge subject. Talk about some of the challenges of concurrent application between both levels of proportionality, assuming that ad bellum proportionality applies continuously. So one of the main problem in starting to talk about how these two levels of proportionality interact is that we don't really have complete agreement about what ad bellum proportionality means. And I mentioned that briefly in the beginning of the talk. I think most lawyers would look at ad bellum proportionality as a means-end test, right? But we have some in the literature now that actually suggests that harm's benefit has to be incorporated also into proportionality. And unsurprisingly, it comes from international lawyers that write in the just war tradition. So I challenge in the paper, and discuss the challenges in concurrent applications in light of the three possible approaches to use ad bellum proportionality. Okay, I won't discuss the preliminary challenges. I'll just move on. So
can you just put them back just a second so we can see what they are?
I can send you the paper also later if you want.
Got them.
Okay. No, but these challenges kind of permeate the entire discussion, right? So whenever we talk about the relations between the spheres, we have these questions: do we have to argue for complete separation, or whether some conflation is required? What should be the level of decision making on both realms, right? So this is all something that returns in all of the contexts of the analysis. So let's assume that ad bellum proportionality is a quantitative test, or tit for tat, as David Kretzmer calls it, right? So this test says, well, you have to look at the scope of the defensive act, and it should be roughly equal or equated to the armed attack. So I think this actually doesn't have any real interaction with use in Bello proportionality, because use in Bello proportionality looks at the effects of a specific attack. And this and tit for tat looks only at the scope of the defensive action. So this is one issue.
Example. What would be tit for tat ad bellum?
Well, they fired 5 rockets. We fire 5 rockets back.
Oh.
So it looks at this only the scope. Yeah, literally. There is some support for this. In the literature, and maybe even in some ICJ rulings, right? So, not too convincing, but you can find it, okay? My argument that, well, there's no, normatively speaking, there is no much room for interaction, because tit for tat is not really a defensive test, because it doesn't look at the violence that is needed for a defensive action. It just looks at, kind of the just desserts equation. Right, so it's more of it imports into use ad bellum arguments from retribution, right? So it's not really about defense, but it's there. Some people discuss it, right? It gets more interesting if we understand use ad bellum self-defense as a means-end test, meaning we look at the defensive action and we ask whether it was necessary to halt or repel the armed attack, and according to some, imminent further armed attacks, right? So here there is a possible interaction with use in Bello proportionality, and bear with me, it's a bit complex. If we look at the concrete and direct military advantage in use in bello proportionality as including in some way, right, the contribution of the attack to the defensive action at large, then the halt and repel test can affect somehow the proportionality test under use in bello. So it's probably clear for IHL specialists, but if there are others that are less into the IHL discourse, feel free to ask me questions about this, right? So on this view, a concrete and direct military advantage will include not only the generic harm caused to the adversary's armed forces or other tactical advantage, but also the attack's contribution to the defensive cause. And this can potentially cut both ways, right? So if the contribution to the defensive cause is positive, the benefit will be added on top of the regular military advantage. On the other hand, if the contribution of the attack to the general defensive cause is negligible, we might deduce from the military advantage in use ad bellum proportionality. So I would say, to me, there are at least three reasons to reject this view, right? And the first is, I think, probably a well-known objection is from legal policy, right? To the extent to which we make the concrete and direct military advantage a wider, more ambiguous type of standard, then we open the door for more ambiguity and abuse, right? Because if anything can be imported into the notion of a military advantage, then we can ex post justify almost anything, right? So every attack can contribute somehow to the defensive action at large. State control the information, right? So this is a great way to really make the use in bello test ineffective. A second reason why I think the just defensive cause should not be incorporated into the military advantage in bello is epistemic considerations, right? So the defensive cause is farther from the attack in terms of causal proximity, right? So in the ethics of decision making, as much as putative benefit is farther from the action, then you have to give it less weight in your consideration, right? So in ethical terms, this good, to the extent that it's a good that we want to consider, cannot really be balanced in front of or in relation to immediate harm to life and limb of civilians. And also, if we think about who can actually have the information to make these, farther down the road assessments, that would not be available usually to the operative levels of command, right? So even if we think that normatively this should enter the concrete and direct military advantage, we wouldn't want forces in the field to make these decisions because they simply don't have the epistemic capabilities to assess this type of test. The third difficulty in this type of conflation is relates to the idea of belligerent equality. So belligerent equality assumes that all IHL tests have to apply equally to all parties, whether they're just or unjust, whether they're aggressors or defenders, right? If we would import the cause of the war into use in bello proportionality, then we would have to allow the aggressor, right, to take into consideration its aggressive aims as part of the military advantage that would justify harm to civilians. And this is, I think, something which doesn't really have any value. And if we don't like this result, then we would have to modify the application of use in Bellum proportionality in accordance with the justness of cause of the parties involved. And this is something that nobody suggests seriously in terms of law. So it seems that under the halt and repel test for ad bellum proportionality, concurrent application shouldn't result in the intermixing between the causes of the war and the notion of military advantage in use in bello proportionality. And I won't get into the interaction between harm benefit, maybe in the Q&A, because I want to leave some time for discussion. You can see that in the paper. Just to kind of give you the bottom line, I think if we adopt a harm benefit approach to use ad bellum proportionality, then there is a lot of overlap with the idea of use in bello proportionality because both deal with harm and benefit, right? But still, I argue that we have to keep these levels of analysis on a separate plane, namely, not only because combatants in the field have no real ability to conduct a general use ad bellum analysis in light of harm benefit. So this is why I argue that even if we adopt this view, the spheres have to be functionally separated. So let's end here. I'll be happy to detail further on in the Q&A. I think the paper makes some complex argument I didn't want to get into right here, but if any of you read it, I'll be happy to elaborate. So thanks.
So, we open the floor. Starting with the list, do you want to collect questions? Or
No.
one by one?
That's one by one.
One by
Yeah.
one. Who's raising his hand first?
In your paper, you have, it was a very good research, and in your paper, you mentioned that American war on Iraq was a kind of continuous war from 1992 to. Yeah, you just were supporting the.
I was supporting that?
I mean, you just explaining. You took the example for that purpose.
Okay.
Yeah. So, isn't it an overstretching justification for one of the principles you?
I think I have to look again. But wait a bit. If what you got from the paper is that I'm making this argument, that I have to kind of check myself, because what I did there. That's what's that's Dinstein's approach. Dinstein said he says that in his even in the new version of the 2017 book that 2017. No, it's just the current edition. That 2003 war in Iraq was actually an extension of the 1990s war, right? And he made a similar argument about clashes between Israel and Syria and Iraq. So it's just an example of where this argument can make a difference, but I'm not endorsing it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Just
so
a
okay.
little bit explain.
So
if you
I have to see. Okay, thanks.
Robert.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for a very, very important, I think, article. I just submitted a PhD on something very similar and saying all the time when reading it how bad I didn't have this insights that you wrote in your 2 months ago, 3 months ago.
Okay.
Anyway, so 2 comments or thoughts that I had. One is this, I fully agree with your line of reasoning about the continuous application of use of Bello proportionality. Yet again, just when trying to being from the practical side, when it came to the way that you break down the Syrian example. This is where, again, I recall of the problems that we have in use ad bellum, and one of them is the fact that there's uncertainty about the scenario. The scenario that you give can be explained on different planes or different ways from both sides. Okay, so
right.
If you and there's no one around to say who is right once the Security Council is not doing its job. There's no one to say this is right and this is wrong, and the story is different, and there's no way either ante or exposed to clarify what was really going. So, for example, in this case, if you have a drone coming from Syria and shot down, so Israelis putting down the drone platform, and then the Syrians shooting anti-aircraft missiles, but they will say it was against the attack the Israelis were already committing here, and not because it's not from for other reason. And the Israelis look about the whole issue as like, okay, the drone already came, it's an imminent threat, now we have to take down all the platforms, and the story just continue. And one of the main reasons that we keep use ad bellum separate from use in bello is that the fact that use ad bellum is very political. It's it's impossible to know all the time. Even with your 4 questions that you put that to break down the this problem, it's it's almost impossible to know sometimes which is the right answer for each. What is the right answer for each of your 4 questions? Still, I think that your your approach on continuous proportionality is correct. Maybe my thought was things should not be so detailed question that you have to answer, but a larger question that if something turns out to something very different what it began, it's a more larger question, holistic view of the conflict. Maybe then it will be you can decide that the shift there has been a shift from this side with the fall to the others. I'm just not sure that it's practically possible to get to a right conclusion, or it's an analytical conclusion in these cases. No party will say, okay, we did it because every explanation will differ. Every party will blame the other, and you can't know if they're about to shoot another missile or shoot another drone or not. And they didn't do that just because you destroyed that platform. That's one issue I had with the first part of the with the article. Which I think it's again, that's the only problem I say with it. You're right, but that's the practicability of that issue, and the dangers are so important that one of the main reasons that we keep these realms apart. And the other thing is on the second part of the article, the in bello proportionality and the relationship with the ad bellum. Well, actually, I was thinking all over that the proportionality connection. It's only part of the larger question of the interplay between use ad bellum and in bello. For example, it's like a cut and paste for discrimination. If it's a military, it won't be a military objective, or will it not be a military objective if it fits the largest just the 52. Yeah. So you don't even get to the proportionality because you have the problem if there is it's interlinked. If just ad bellum affects the question, if it's a military objective on the first part, and you will not get to the other part. You can, in a way, it's you can take your reasoning and put it on necessity, and you mentioned that, and discrimination, and it's almost be the same. I think that's my thought on that.
I want to follow up on that point because you start your discussion from the talking about the traditional just war theory and the revisionist just war theory, and I've been recently reading quite a lot about this because this has a huge part of my PhD work, and to the extent that even when you buy and agree with the revisionist, there is that little point of practical implementation where even the biggest leaders of the revisionist approach would say, yeah, but practically we need to still, when you go to international law, when you need to practically in the laws of war and in bello, we need in order to make it practical and usable to stay with the traditional approach.
Okay, no, thanks. Great comments, and thanks for clarifying that. First of all, I was wondering, what your the problems that you were referring to in the first part of your question, I think are problems with use ad bellum at large.
Exactly.
Right? So I don't know if they're exactly about this specific problem of how to assess use ad bellum continually, but it permeates the entire field, and yet somehow nobody really thinks that we should just give up on use ad bellum, right? So I think this is a challenge that this paper doesn't solve, but I fully agree that it's there. Regarding the issue with counter responses in detail, it's funny because this paper is written for a workshop that took place at West Point, and I presented there in October, and present were many people from the U.S. military and many lawyers from the military establishment as well as other scholars. And there the push was, well, you have to operationalize and make, give examples or how to detail this, that this could be workable, right? So we see this this tragedy of law, and once you make something detailed, so you really you lose the bigger picture. But if you make something general, then it's completely, indeterminate. So what I was trying to do is kind of try to break it down into ways of thinking about these questions analytically. But I agree that with your suggestion that at the end of the day it's going to be, and I hate to say this, but, lawyers get to this point at some point, a test of reasonableness in the sense of, was it reasonable to assume that at this point you would not have any more counter responses? And also, again, coming back to the issue of uncertainty. So let's assume that there is uncertainty, but then we have another question, which is kind of taken for granted. Okay, so assuming that there's uncertainty, how do you act under uncertainty? And I'm not sure that the default answer is, well, you attack, right? So sometimes, specifically in terms of these clashes we're talking about between Israel and Syria, or Israel and Iran in Syria, you take risk if you stop the attack. You take a risk, but nobody thinks that you're taking a risk that now the state of Israel will be brought to an end. The risk is maybe they will launch another rocket, right? I'm not I'm not saying that this is completely insignificant, but in conditions of uncertainty, considering the potential of escalation, considering killing people on the other side and killing your own soldiers, right? So perhaps uncertainty calls for carefulness and not for just continuing on, right? Regarding the issue that this is part of the general conflation question discussion, I fully agree. But this is a paper about conflation and specifically in proportionality. This was the conference. It was about necessity and proportionality, not about distinction. And I think, there's a lot of literature about conflation, but sometimes it's kind of, in a general way. I try to look into really, the specificities of possible conflation, really in detail. But I agree with the comment, and also, yeah, of course, once we agree that conflation is something that can take place, if we agree, I'm not sure, then it might affect many things, right? And Ido, yeah, you're completely right that revisionists have this concession that they make. So they destroy, I think, the foundations for a lot of these assumptions, but then they say, well, but practically we shouldn't change law because in terms of rule consequentialism or in terms of the lesser evil, this is the best we can do, right? But note that they say that about belligerent equality. What McMahon does is he challenges the idea of belligerent equality, but then he says, well, we can't really do without belligerent equality in positive law. I'm defending belligerent equality here. I'm not challenging it, right? I'm applying the revisionist thinking into how proportionality can apply use ad bellum, right? And maybe in terms of the conflation. So I'm not dealing with that issue. If you look at other, when others in revisionist just war theory write about proportionality, they don't make the same concession about continuous application. They actually reach very difficult sometimes conclusions. That if you read the paper, you saw that McMahon thinks that you can't do a continuous assessment of proportionality because you have the sunk cost problem. That the harm that you generated, that you caused before, cannot really affect the harm that you're continuing to cause, or the equation from now on. It's an interesting argument. It really throws you into this imbalance. This is what I think philosophers have to do to lawyers. But yeah, so I agree, but it's a different sphere of argument. Okay, thanks.
I'm just going to focus on the legal issues, not the philosophical ones. And my comments are strangely similar to yours. I'm not sitting beside you again. So I was intrigued by the formal animosity approach, and to me it's just, we should be looking at it through the lens of the tests of use of force, and it's a question of imminence and necessity. That's the test now, and I was intrigued by your point about the default position, the likelihood, and presumably we look backwards and see what has been the practice until now, and that will affect our assessment of the likelihood of something occurring again, and therefore the imminence, or at least the necessity. That's just my way of looking at it. Instinctively, I completely agree with the concurrent continuous application. Just instinctively it's right, but then I struggle on exactly the same points in terms of how do we apply it in practice. And when you initially had the point up saying who makes this decision, I was going, why is this relevant? But I now see it can be relevant from an IHL point of view, because there could be an attack which is perfectly legitimate under IHL because it meets the proportionality standards, but somehow if you start injecting the ad bellum standards in, it might no longer be permissible.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa is easier in a way, because it's not the poor guy sitting there with instructions to carry out an attack which is perfectly legitimate, who's somehow got to understand the bigger framework of the conflict. Mm-hmm. Because suddenly his attack or her attack might no longer be legitimate under ad bellum. So I'm kind of left wondering, how do we make it work in practice? And I've read your paper and I really enjoyed it. I read it some time ago. I can't remember how you get us out of this. I can't remember what your conclusion is as to how we apply it in practice. And I suppose one reaction I had to the latest discussion you had, you used the word conflation, and in my mind it has a negative connotation. Well, I think we're in a situation of concurrent application, and it reminds me a bit of the struggles we had earlier about the concurrent application of IHL and human rights, and we were all trying to figure that one out. And I'm wondering whether we just don't need to go
So that's
through
already figured out.
Well, now that we've sorted that one out,
Okay.
I'm wondering whether it isn't a similar exercise of how to figure out the interplay, because I think it's, as long as we don't unintentionally conflate, as long as we stay intellectually rigorous, we then have to say, okay, well, how do we figure out this interplay? But maybe your conclusion has an answer.
So let me begin with the issue of condition of animosity. When we talk about imminence is always a circumstantial issue, and it always looks at specific facts, and it looks at intentions, right? When we make an imminent decision, we make some kind of assumption about the adversary's intentions. So all I'm saying, I'm not saying this is the determining factor, but when you look at all of the factual grounds that you have to consider when asking whether there is imminence, the fact that you are in a situation in which there is a formal state of war, right? The parties are in the situation in which they admit their political, even if not legal, animosity between them, right? I think this adds something to the test.
Pushes you along.
Yeah, it's not the determining factors. Oh, if it's a formal state of war, that's it, imminence, whatever they do.
And it's all about
But
necessity,
I mean, it's
isn't
only
it?
logic when you just have to make this thought experiment and take two states that are
I'm
informal.
not quibbling you, not at all. I'm saying
Okay.
it all goes into necessity, and it's all the elements that help us determine whether
I agree.
use of force is necessary.
Yeah, it's not a proportionality question.
No. It's
I just
necessity.
addressed that in the
No, I
paper
agree.
just to make sure that I'm not, being, too naive in the sense that I'm not saying this is meaningless. We only have to look at, So yeah. Regarding the conclusion, concurrent application doesn't have to mean conflation, right? Just as, different bodies of law apply concurrently to a certain situation without, necessarily conflating between them. My general conclusion in the paper is that for the various reasons that I detail, whenever we start to make conflation, at least in proportionality, we get adverse results. Mainly, probably the most significant barrier is the issue of belligerent equality. That whenever you make this conflation in the way you apply proportionality, you would have to either grant the aggressor more leeway to achieve their aggressive aim, which is ridiculous, or you have to apply proportionality differently, and then we collapse into the same thing that the revisionists argue, that
so in practical terms, even though intuitively it makes sense in terms of legal framework, it doesn't actually, applying it concurrently undermines some of the fundamental
not necessarily
dimensions.
not
When
necessarily.
wouldn't it?
When you keep the decision level making separate, right? So the
I will join Bargin for a second. One of the things that you have in current warfare is that you have on the one side the strategic corporal on the one side, and the other you have the big decision maker who's making very specific decisions or attack. Also, you have it's so. They
can't make these
they
decisions.
try to. They do. I mean, I think the Israeli published after the 2014 Gaza conflict. There was a report saying, and they were saying loud and clear that some decisions were made, some concrete decision makers were made by the highest by politicians. It's very.
it's a
Because to
reverse.
me it sounds as if you're saying similar things to keep
Okay.
them separate. No, but you're
No, you
disagreeing
can't-
with each
I
other. Or
think
you're saying you can't?
I think you can't.
Okay.
Today you can't keep them
You
separate
can't.
because the decision making is done from all sides. From even the higher levels are doing specific decision making, and the lower levels are trying to
But
trying to
let
do
me ask you
even
this
hard.
question. So, is the lower level of command, so platoon or a bit higher, right? Can they actually decide on their own
I fully agree with that.
to inflict wide incidental harm to civilians because they think that this attack has strategic
It's not part of the
meaning?
decision.
Yeah, so I think usually when people talk about the strategic corporal phenomenon, it's not in positive terms. They're saying that it's a problem nowadays that regular foot soldiers not trained in making these types of decisions. If they make wrong decisions, it can influence the entire situation. But I don't think this affects whether conflation is normatively desirable or not. It's just something it's an additional challenge. So Manu, I don't understand exactly why you think that once there's concurrent application, there's no way to separate between them.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm just trying to figure out how it could work.
Well,
Just because I come through you with your arguments. I agree
okay.
at every step, and then I say, okay, but that leaves us in a really difficult situation. How do we get out of it? I'm not disagreeing at all. I'm looking to you for saying, okay, as I've followed you all this way, help me get out of it.
I think the problem becomes very hard to resolve if we adopt a harm-benefit use ad bellum approach, because then these two levels of analysis, and in morality, when we talk about ethics of war, this is proportionality. It's harm-benefit. It's all across the board, right? And also in public discourse. But in legal terms, I show that if we adopt the harm-benefit approach on proportionality, then there's a strong push towards conflation. It's very hard to distinguish between them, at least when we look at the conflict as a whole. But if we look at the halt and repel test, which I think most lawyers will agree that's a relevant ad bellum test for proportionality, then
Yes.
you can still keep them separately because, as you know,
that's
so
far more focused,
right.
isn't
So
it?
the part of the danger in terms of legal certainty when you adopt the ad bellum harm benefit approach is that then it's very hard to keep them apart. And I have issues with people that write that proportionality ad bellum has to be harm benefit in terms of law.
Yeah, I agree.
For many
Can I ask
many
one
practical
last question?
reasons.
Has there been any court decision that has actually looked at this? And because I'm thinking at reparations, but the only instances in which I'm aware of where there's been reparations is, for example, UNCC, and it just completely blurred everything. It's losses arising as a direct result of. So you didn't.
There's
really
also
have
the
a package.
Ethiopia Eritrea claim
Exactly.
something. Actually, I'm working on another paper. Working is a bit overstretching it. I'm trying to get to working on a paper that would look at the issue of reparations for lawful infliction of harm by the aggressor.
Interesting. And there's
Tom
now-
Dannenbaum has a good book about aggression that he kind of deals with.
And there's
why-
going to be the ICJ. I hadn't even realised it was still ongoing. The DRC Uganda. They've now reached the reparation stage.
Yeah. I have to look at
So
that.
it's just happening now. So that might also shed some light on the thinking.
Yeah. I have to look.
Thanks. It's, as always, really interesting. And my questions are also kind of similar, so I'm not unique, but maybe there's something here. And it relates to, I'm not sure that I totally understood the difference between the realist position of the first reasoning and the limitlessness argument of the second one. So it relates to these two.
Okay, I don't think there's a real difference.
Okay, and just so.
Okay.
So I think that the question relates to these two positions, and it adds the strength or the effectiveness of the legal regime into consideration when we think about the pragmatics and I think that you need to address it. Even if, and I also share the normative right position as the pro-continuous application position, but I do think that the real challenge is if we care about use ad bellum, we want to make it as clear as possible, as open to less open to abuse as possible, and so on. And you yourself alluded to these considerations when you talked about in Bello proportionality, right? You said if we're opening it to abuse. And then you said when you were questioned about the ad bellum proportionality, you said, well, it's a problem all across, but we agree that in Bello proportionality is complicated. We don't want to make it more complicated, and we can agree that ad bellum proportionality is complicated. And
no, I don't want to make it more. My argument about using Bello is not that we don't have to make it more complicated; is that we don't have to make it more ambiguous. Which is not the same.
Ad bellum, I can just switch the word to more ambiguous. Okay, so we don't want to make it more ambiguous. Ad bellum proportionality is already ambiguous. We don't want to make it more ambiguous. And I think that this is a real challenge because it will the obvious result will be more strategic accusations of ad bellum violations and less teeth to the regime, or at least it's a plausible result of this type of argument. And I think that what Robert was hinting at, that maybe you should try to make, and it relates to the questions that you received in West Point, to make the test as clear or as distinct as possible, or only at one point in time or so on, like when do we have to end the war or something like this, in order to open to limit the abuse of the ad bellum regime. So this is the first point. The second is also relates to what I want to ask now, is who makes the decision, right? And it also relates to the need to make it more limited or narrower, because if you're afraid of belligerent equalities, I see it from a practical point of view, not necessarily from a moral perspective. We want to continue the separation because we want to have similar incentives to both sides of the conflict not to violate the law. So if the obvious example, right? If a German soldier knows that he's going to be executed for participating in an unjust war, he will have no incentive to not kill civilians or whatever.
Right.
So here, even if we keep it separate, if we pose ad bellum obligations on some generals or high-level commanders, we do have the danger of giving different incentives.
Well, you mean in terms of criminal law? Because I wasn't referring to that.
In terms of criminal law.
Okay,
and so
yeah,
on.
of course, that's a different discussion. Okay.
And so, if I'm now as a general, I decide on an offensive that is clearly legal from a Bello point of view, but I'm facing an ad bellum violations because it's not necessary.
Yeah, it's not the same, because then you will be punished for aggression but not for war crimes. If you you can get more years in jail.
The German soldier in the original example will be punished, right, for the same. So the incentives, right, are not 100% similar, but we do want to maximize the incentive of sparing the lives of civilians and so on. So even if we think about it, maybe the test should be applied to strategic decisions that are relevant to the political branch rather than the military one. But it has substantial implications, because it needs to be the kind of decision that the political leaders are making, like the decision to attack a new front or something like this, and not more limited strategic
Okay, I
decisions.
fully agree with the latter point. But just I'm intrigued. So let's assume that you agree that the basic ad bellum test for self-defense proportionality is halt and repel. I'm saying that there's no way to look at this, in disconnect from the temporal issue. Halt and repel is something that you have to look throughout, the time continuum. So what I'm saying here is, I think it's not revolutionary at all. I'm not adding anything to use ad bellum. Assuming that we agree that if there is a limitation, that means that you can use force in order to repel the attack. But this can only be judged, on some kind of, somewhere in the time spectrum. What Dinstein alludes to is that you have to do it. He can't accept the halt and repel test, because the halt and repel is not something that you judge when you decide to go to war in the first instance. I mean, that's not where that's not the way you can assess this. So what I'm thinking is, I don't think what I'm suggesting complicates use ad bellum. I think it's something that justifies the ongoing halt and repel approach. And let's say I didn't really understand. Why would you think that this makes it more ambiguous?
I think, and this is something that I didn't look up, so maybe I'm wrong, but I think that most of the debates around use ad bellum relates to the initial attack or initial response, practically. And let's say, even from the halt and repel point of view, you say, okay, now this is needed in order to halt the attack. Whether we succeed or not, or how do we pursue it, it's a different question. But if we continue to apply this test throughout the conflict, then there are so many points to raise ad bellum arguments to either side that, again, makes it extremely complicated. Just as in the beginning, it just adds, 15 more points of normative vagueness and debate that will make it enables. I think that it enables almost every conflict to be a constant war about ad bellum from both sides, to both parties throughout the conflict, in a way that will make it more meaningless than it is today.
Okay, interesting. I'm not sure. If we look at the Second Lebanon War, I think all of the debate, or close to all of the debate, was not about so there was the initial attack by Hezbollah, right? And then there was a response by Israel, which triggered a counter response by Hezbollah, and then we know what happened. Right? All of the proportionality assessments of that campaign, which I know looked at didn't only analyze the first resort to defensive force by Israel, but the entire way in which Israel conducted its campaign after the initial attack stopped, right? So I think in terms of practice, I think people tend to look at the more continuous approach. And again, my main issue with this is that if we adopt this reasoning, so we have to do away with the halt and repel test, because the halt and repel test can only be assessed on a time continuum, and then we have to look at we have to adopt a version of the tit for tat approach, right? So, and I think that's hard to reconcile with self-defense. But I'm aware that I struggled a lot with this Clausewitzian objection, because really the counter responses is. So I fully agree, but I'm not sure it necessarily complicates. And if we think of it, in practical terms, so you would expect that when the cabinet meets every week, every few days, it has to ask, okay, have we countered the threat, right? Is the campaign now something that is beyond the threat, or emerging new threats that are going to continue if we're going to stop the war? So I'm not sure it's something too radical to suggest. But thanks for thoughtful comments.
Any other comments, suggestions, ideas, bananas?
Noam Nobel is also writing about this, isn't he?
Yeah, I think so.
Do you know
What?
what?
We
can ask him.
No, but if we look at they're recording this now. But if we look at the recent International Law Association report on the use of force, there are interesting things about proportionality there. For instance, they seem to be open to the harm-benefit approach to proportionality. So without any knowledge about this, I would not be surprised if we had something that kind of deals with that. So, but I don't know. He hasn't talked to me about that.
I think it's about time to wrap. So thank you very much, Eliav.
Thanks.
And it's time for lunch.